Here's a question I want you to actually answer, not skim past it. What would you do right now, today, if you had absolutely certainty that no one would ever find out? Not the everyday version of that, not no one's watching. The way you mean it, changing lanes without kind of like indicating, where there's still a camera somewhere, still a chance, still a small percentage you're accounting for, kind of like without admitting it. I mean, total certainty. No footage, no witness, no paper trail, no colleague who mentioned it in passing 18 months from now at exactly the wrong dinner. Nothing ever. Fully and permanently unseen. Give that a moment before you answer it. Because here's the uncomfortable part. Most of us have already answered that question. Not today, but years ago. In a moment so small, we didn't clock it as a decision at all. A number rounded the convenient direction. A version of events told slightly cleaner than what actually happened. A corner cut on a piece of work nobody would ever inspect closely enough to catch it. We didn't announce a philosophy of life in that moment. We just quietly discovered which way we lean when the room is empty. And that discovery, not the big public failures, the quiet private ones, is what Solomon spends an enormous amount of energy on. Not motive, not intention, a specific, almost mundane image, a scale. And here's the part almost nobody warns you about when you start building something. And it's worth naming before we go actually any further. The back room doesn't shrink as you succeed. It grows. A junior employee has almost no unwatched room at all. Someone approves his expenses, checks his timesheets, reviews his work before it ever leaves the building. A founder 5 years in has a door that closes. A signing authority nobody questions anymore. A travel budget nobody itemizes line by line. A private message thread with a supplier that no board member would ever read. Every year, you become more trusted. The checking gets thinner and the back room gets bigger, which means the very success this series exists to help you build is also quietly manufacturing more rooms where nobody's watching the scale except for you. In the marketplaces of the ancient Near East, before regulated currency, trade ran on stone weights and a set of balance scales. You didn't hand over coins with a printed value, you handed over silver, grain, wool. And the merchant set stones on one side of the scale to measure how much you owed or how much he owed you. There was no central bank checking those stones, no inspector visiting every stall. The entire economy ran on a single fragile assumption that the stone in the merchant's hand actually weighed what he said it weighed, which the honesty of an entire transaction happened in a moment nobody could audit. The customer watched the needle settle. He didn't watch the drawer the stones came from. Solomon writes about this constantly, far more than you'd expect for what sounds like a narrow commercial complaint, because he's not actually talking about market stalls. He's talking about you. And I want to read from Proverbs 11 verse 1. It says this: a false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. Sit with the word he chooses, abomination. That's one of the strongest words in the whole book. Reserved. Everywhere else it appears for things like violence, cruelty, the worst of human conduct. And here Solomon spends it on a shopkeeper's scale. Not because scales are sacred, because what the scale reveals isn't sacred either. It's just unusually hard to fake. A man can manage his public face for years. He cannot manage for very long which weight he actually reaches for when he thinks no one is counting. Here's the word itself quickly, because it matters more than it sounds like it should. Integrity doesn't originally mean moral or honest or even good. It comes from the same root as integer, a whole number, undivided, not fractured into separate pieces, which means the opposite of an integrous life was never simply a dishonest one. It's a divided one, a life running two different arithmetics depending on which room you happen to be standing in. So that's where we're starting this today. Not with your intentions, not with what you'd say under oath about your own character, with the stones you keep in the back room, the ones nobody but you has ever seen you choose. Let's go back there and look at how the trick actually worked. Here's how a dishonest merchant in Solomon's world actually ran his scale, because the mechanics matter. He didn't own one set of weights. He owned two. A heavier set used when, he was the one buying. So when he weighed out payment for goods coming in, the scale read fair, while he was actually receiving more than he gave. And a lighter set used for, when he was selling. So when you weighed out grain going to a customer, the scale read fair, while the customer walked away with less than he paid for. Same scale, same steady hand, same look of honest concentration on his face while he worked the balance. The only thing that changed was which pouch he reached into. And he reached into a different one depending on who was standing in front of him and what he stood to gain. And that's precisely what Solomon names twice more, almost word for word, as if he wants to make sure you don't read past it the first time. And that's Proverbs 20 verse 23. It says, unequal weights are an abomination to the Lord, and false scales are not good. He wrote it twice. Two sets, one scale. And the abomination isn't the dishonesty in the abstract. It's the specific, deliberate act of keeping a second standard on hand for whenever the first one becomes inconvenient. We don't carry stone weights anymore. So let's be honest about where the second pouch actually lives right now. It's the invoice you notice is wrong, that's in your favor, and quietly don't correct. It's the version of the story you give your board that's cleaner than the version you know is the truth. It's how you speak to the junior team member when the client's in the room against how you speak to them 40 minutes later when the client's gone. It's a number in the report that's technically not a lie, worded that way on purpose. None of these require you to be a villain. They only require you to keep two sets of weights and know instinctively which one a given room calls for. I've watched this happen to a genuinely good operator, not a con man, a decent, likable founder who ran a warm all hands and would put generosity in the deck as stated value. But in public, in the room that everyone could see, he used the heavy set, generous credit to competitors, transparent numbers with his team, real patience with a hire who was struggling. But at 11 at night, in a message thread to a supplier 3 tiers down his own chain, someone who would never sit across the table from him, never show up in an investor's update, he used the light one. Terms he'd never have proposed face-to-face. Delay blamed on the supplier that was actually his own team's fault. Nobody in that company ever saw both messages side by side. That's the entire function of keeping two pouches. You never have to answer for the light one because the only people grading you are the ones who only ever see the heavy. And here's a part that should actually worry us because it's more dangerous than getting caught. You can build an excellent public reputation entirely out of the heavy set. The version you only bring out when you're being watched, and never once let anyone see the light one. Reputation is simply what other people calculate from the weights you actually let them see. Character is which stones are actually sitting in your pocket when the shop is empty. And it is entirely possible for years to have a flawless reputation and a private set of weights that would ruin it in a single afternoon if anyone ever looked. Solomon isn't gentle about where that road ends either. Proverbs 10 verse 9 says, whoever walks in integrity walks securely, but he who makes his ways crooked will be found out. Found out, not might be, will be. Not because there's always a whistleblower waiting in the wings, most of the time there isn't, but because a man running 2 sets of weights eventually forgets under pressure which room he's standing in. The crooked path isn't secure even when it isn't discovered, because the man walking in it has to keep 2 ledges straight in his own head for the rest of his life. That's not a punishment bolted on from outside. That's just what the second pouch costs you every single day that you keep it. And notice what Solomon is willing to trade for this, because it tells you exactly how seriously he takes it. Proverbs 28 verse 6, better is a poor man who walks in his integrity than a rich man who is crooked in his own ways. Better poor and honest than wealthy and crooked. Not almost, or especially not almost always, not usually, all else being equal, better. Full stop. No asterisk. Asterisk for now, the big win, how big the win was. That's a direct challenge to the quiet assumption running underneath most ambition, that the win, once it's big enough, retroactively justifies how you got there. Solomon, arguably the wealthiest man in his own nation ever produced, says the opposite. He'd rather you finish poor holding 1 set of weights than rich holding 2. Coming from him, that's not a comforting line for people who didn't make it. It's a warning for people who actually did or is on their way of doing so. Now, you could read all of that as a warning about consequences. Get the lightweights out too often and eventually somebody, weighs your grain back and notices. That's true, but it's actually the shallow version of what Solomon's building toward. Because if the only reason you keep 1 set of weights is fear of eventually being found out, you haven't solved the actual problem. You've just added a third pouch, a public one, a private one, and a slightly more careful private one for whenever the odds of discovery go up. That's risk management wearing integrity's clothes. So there has to be a different reason to keep 1 set of weights everywhere, in every room, whether anyone is ever going to check or not. And Solomon's answer to that isn't fear at all. Here's the verse that changes what this whole conversation has been about. Proverbs 21 verse 2. Every way of a man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the heart. Read that first half slowly because it's not flattering. Every way of a man is right in his own eyes. That's not a warning about other people's self-deception. That's you. That's me. Left entirely to our own internal audit, we will always find a way to explain the lightweight as reasonable, the rounded number as harmless, the version of the story as basically true. Self-assessment is the one instrument in the whole operation that cannot be trusted, because the very person running it is the one with something to gain from the reading coming out clean, which is exactly why the second half of that verse isn't a threat. It's closer to a relief. The Lord weighs the heart. There is, in fact, an accurate scale, one that isn't self-reported, one you can't quietly recalibrate under pressure. And Solomon comes back to his same idea from a different angle a few chapters later, and this time he makes sure you can't wriggle out of it with kind of like ignorance. And that's in Proverbs 24 verse 12. It says, if you say, behold, we did not know this, does not he who weighs the heart perceive it? And will he not repay man according to his work? Does not he who weighs the heart perceive it? Notice Solomon keeps returning to that exact verb, weighs. It's the same picture as the marketplace scale, just turn around and point it at you. Somebody is always checking which stones you actually keep. You've simply spent your life assuming the checking only happens when a customer is watching. Now, here's where I want you to be careful, or I want to be careful, because there are 2 completely different ways to live with that sentence, and only one of them is actually good news. You can hear, he who weighs the heart perceives it, and live the rest of your life the way that this honest merchant lived his, glancing over your shoulder, keeping the good ways out a little longer just in case, managing an invisible inspector the way you'd manage a suspicious customer. Call that surveillance anxiety with a theological label on it, not integrity. You've still got 2 pouches. You've just added a third audience to perform for. Or, and this is the turn the whole episode has been walking toward, you can actually believe the second half of that first verse that we read earlier on. Not, the Lord checks the weight, the Lord delights in the just one. Go back and read that again. Proverbs 11 verse 1. A false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. His delight, not his tolerance, not the bare minimum he'll accept before penalizing you. Delight, which means the honest weight was never primarily about avoiding a hidden inspection. It was always about the character of the one doing the weighing and whether you actually want to be that kind of person for his sake, not just his checking. This, by the way, is where most companies quietly get the whole project backwards. When a leader senses the 2 pouches problem creeping into culture, the instinct is almost always more external scale. Another approval layer, another audit, policy written in direct response to last year's failure. And controls have their place. I'm not arguing against a second signature on a large wire transfer, but a policy can only ever catch a light, or especially a lightweight, after somebody's already reached for it. It cannot make a single person love the heavy one instead. You can build the most audited company in your industry and still have a back room in every employee's head that no policy will ever enter. Because policies govern behavior in front of witnesses. And the entire subject this morning is what happens in the room the witness never reaches. Job understood this better than almost anyone in Scripture. And he says something that should genuinely startle you the first time you hear it clearly. And that's in Job 31 verse 6. Let me be weighed in a just balance, and let God know my integrity. Job doesn't ask to be spared the scale. He asks to be put on it. Is a man staking his entire life willingly on the same instrument the dishonest merchant spent his whole career avoiding? That's not the posture of someone managing fear. That's the posture of someone who's already deciding which weights he actually loves and has nothing left to hide from the auditor who cannot be fooled. And that's the difference between the merchant with 2 pouches and a man like Job. It isn't that Job never sins. He's not claiming that. It's that he isn't running 2 ledgers. There's no back room in his life with a different set of stones in it, kept ready for whenever the front room isn't looking. Wholeness, which is what the word integrity has always actually meant, all the way back to its root, isn't the absence of failure, it's the absence of a second hidden set of weights. So picture the shop again, one more time. At the end of the day, the customers are gone, the ledger's closed for the night, there's no sale left to earn, no reputation left to build in the next 10 minutes, nothing left. In fact, that keeping the heavy set out could actually earn him. He reaches for the scale to put it away. Which stones does he leave sitting in the drawer for tomorrow? That's the only moment any of this was actually about. Not the transaction everyone in the market watched him complete an hour ago. The one in the empty shop after closing when the choice has stopped paying anything at all. When there's no customer left to impress and no reputation left to protect, and the only thing still in the room is him and the stones he actually reaches for. Somewhere tonight, your own scale is sitting in a back room that only you can see into. Nobody's going to audit it. No client is going to ask what you actually decided in there. The whole exercise of your integrity this week is going to happen almost entirely in rooms exactly like that one. It's quiet. It's unwitnessed, paying nothing. The question was never really whether anyone would check. Somebody always does. Solomon told you that at the very start of this. The real question is which weight you actually reach for when it's just you, and whether you're reaching for it out of fear of the inspection or love for the one who delights in it. And here's the strange mercy hiding inside all of this. Tomorrow's transaction, the one people will actually see, the one your reputation quietly depends on, gets decided tonight in the back room by a version of you nobody's grading. Every public act of integrity you've ever admired in somebody else was assembled, one unwatched choice at a time, in 100 rooms exactly like that one. Nobody applauds the back room. Nobody ever will. It's still the only room that was ever actually deciding anything. Because a life is really just a very long series of unwatched rooms, one after the other. And the sum of what you did in all of them is the only integrity you ever actually had. So go out and choose your stones. Thank you for joining Wisdom today.